Beginning our broadcast today, earlier this month, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit issued a ruling immediately canceling the registration of 3 products primarily used in Dicamba-resistant soybean. The question is, how will this affect farmers, applicators, and others? On Tuesday, I spoke with UNL agricultural law professor Terry Centner to get the latest.
Okay, the 3 products are XtendiMax, Engenia and FeXapan, and these are 3 herbicides to kill weeds that were developed by Bayer Crop Science, BASF, and Corteva. And what they do and why they are important is they can be applied to soybeans and cotton after the plants are up. So often herbicides have to be applied before the plants are up, but because we have specially genetically modified seeds that can tolerate this herbicide, they can be sprayed up to 45 days for soybeans after the soybeans have been planted.
How have things progressed since the news last week to where we are here on Tuesday morning?
Well, a lot has happened in a week. As most people know, on June 3rd, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in the West Coast vacated the 3 registrations for the herbicides I've just mentioned. With that court order, state departments of agriculture responded to say, well, the herbicides have not been canceled, the registrations have not been canceled, so we're going to allow them to be used. However, on June 8th, 2020, the EPA issued its final order canceling the registrations for these 3 pesticides. And so what this means is they cannot be sold or marketed or moved in interstate commerce because of this court order. But the court order went further, and we can talk about that a little later. But it's important to realize that the action by the Environmental Protection Agency overrides state orders.
And yeah, just give us a quick explainer as to why the EPA made the move to do this final cancellation order, because it mentions adverse effects to human health and the environment. And it seems like all herbicides may kind of fall under those categories. So why would these 3? Anything you can expound on there?
Well, this is an interesting question and why it's hard to know how to regulate pesticides or herbicides, because as you mentioned, all of them have some negative effects. And so the question basically becomes the evidence. What scientific evidence is there about how many adverse effects there are? And if there are too many adverse effects, then of course we're going to have to do something about it, and that would be to cancel the registration, or more likely, the pesticide would never become registered if there were too many adverse effects. So the adverse effects for these 3 herbicides were the drift damages, basically, that they were harming vegetation and other crops. And we were aware of this from the beginning. We thought it could be minimized, and unfortunately, the first year the herbicides were used, it was not minimized. So the EPA and actually the manufacturers worked together to come up with additional regulations limiting when the herbicides could be used so that we cut down on the drift damages. And I think that these new ideas that were implemented in 2018 and then again in 2019 were helpful. They reduced the damages, but unfortunately they did not reduce them enough. And so there were continuing to be a lot of damages to neighboring vegetation and crops. We actually don't have a good figure of how much damage there was, although there was enough damage that there was some community angst, and this was mentioned by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, that farmers that were not using the GMO seeds were upset because their crops were being damaged by their neighbors, and yet they didn't want to complain about their neighbors. And there was considerable dissatisfaction by State Department of Agriculture in the expenses that they had to expend to look into all of the complaints. With the skyrocketing complaints, state departments of agriculture, or that agency that's in charge of registration of pesticides in that state, are expected to look into complaints. And they were expending way too many resources looking into the complaints from these 3 herbicide products.
And you mentioned it before. I think it's important to hammer home that what the EPA says is going to supersede what any state department says, like the Nebraska Department of Agriculture, for instance. Are there any other impacts that Nebraska producers need to understand or be aware of, how this ruling impacts them?
Yes, the ruling, or actually it's the EPA final order that is impacting us, because that involves the cancellation of these 3 herbicides. And the EPA very explicitly outlined what to do with outstanding stocks. And this was a big concern for producers and for commercial applicators of herbicides. And so the EPA had these ideas in mind because similar thing happened in 2015 when the court ordered the insecticide sulfoxaflor to be vacated. And so the EPA canceled that registration in 2015, and basically the EPA is following that procedure in 2020 with the cancellation of these 3 herbicides. So under the cancellation order that was issued on June 8th, producers can continue to use their stocks of these herbicides up until July 31st. So this is good news for producers. They don't have to return them, although they can return them, and they can use them to control weeds as planned. And presumably they should be able to use up all of their stocks, because you can use these herbicides for about 45 days after the seeds were planted. And hopefully all our soybean seeds would be planted by June 16th, and we could then use these herbicides up to July 31st as allowed under the Environmental Protection Agency's final order. I also noted that we can return the stocks to manufacturers, and so that is a possibility for producers, and it's also a possibility for commercial applicators. Commercial applicators are a separate category, and they are also able to apply these herbicides up until July 31st. After that date, it's illegal, and it's also illegal for applicators or producers to sell or distribute them or move them to other people at this time.